Welcome to the second and final part of this special edition of the Found in Philadelphia podcast. This episode continues my conversation with Professor Elijah Anderson. I've had the privilege to be in conversation with Professor Anderson over the past 3 years, reading his books and learning about his work in the streets of Philadelphia. If you missed the first part of this interview, let me remind you that Professor Anderson is an ethnographer who's currently the Sterling Professor of Sociology and African American Studies at Yale University. He's also the winner of the 2021 Stockholm Prize in Criminology. Professor Anderson lived in Philly for many years when he taught at the University of Pennsylvania, and he's done most of his research in Philadelphia, listening to and learning from the people who live here. He's the author of 5 books, 4 of which are about people in Philly. In the last episode, we learned about Professor Anderson's coming of age during the Civil Rights era and his PhD work at the University of Chicago. Then we followed him to his position as professor at the University of Pennsylvania and his work studying how Black and white neighbors navigated the streets of West Philly, which he wrote about in his book, Streetwise. After Streetwise, Professor Anderson turned from the borderlands of gentrifying West Philadelphia to study neighborhoods in the city that were dealing with deep poverty and growing violence. His findings fill his 3rd book, Code of the Streets, which was published in 1999. Professor Anderson was working on his book during the 1990s. This decade was one of Philly's deadliest, with some of the highest rates of violent crime, aggravated assault, robbery, and vehicle theft on record. And he worked in neighborhoods devastated by this violence.
I became very concerned about why so many Black people were killing each other. I mean, urban violence was a big issue. And I looked at North Philadelphia. I looked at Germantown. I looked at Mantua. I looked at Southwest. And I began to put together this account of why so many people are killing each other. And this is really to do with managing the public space, so to speak. And the sense of the people, I realized, was that there are 2 systems of law, one for Black people, one for white people. But whether this is true or not, objectively speaking, a lot of people believe that. In Black communities that are really ghettoized, at ground zero, you can call the police and they may not come. When they come, they may abuse you. And so you don't have much faith in the place. You deal with stuff yourself. And you let people know in no uncertain terms that I'm not going to call the police. I'm going to deal with you myself. So that sets the stage for violence, you see.
In these conditions, street credibility came to be seen as a thing of real value, maybe the only thing that provided protection. But it also fueled violence.
So to manage the situation, you need street cred. And that's all about being able to promise retributive violence for any transgression toward you or your loved ones. And to the extent that you can do that, then people leave you alone. That's the thought. But street credibility, I realize, is really difficult to manage. And you get it by doing deeds, People test you, and you don't get it once and for all. You have to keep on reinforcing it through your actions, through your words, through the way you walk, the way you talk, the way you act. When you have street cred, you basically have this credibility that people respect. When they challenge that and challenge it thoroughly, then you can feel yourself to be under attack, but also vulnerable. So you have to keep on getting it. At ground zero, it's like a tinderbox. But as you move away from ground zero, it's not as important. And in middle-class communities, white or Black, it's not that important because the law, the police are likely to respond in favorable ways.
But in communities that felt abandoned and unprotected, or even threatened by law enforcement, then street credibility remained critical. In addition, there were few good jobs in these neighborhoods, and people turned to an underground economy that allowed violence to thrive.
And so in order to deal with life, people have to supplement their income through the underground economy of bartering, hustling, street crime even, and of course, drugs. And drugs in so many of these neighborhoods I found are all over the place. The drug trade, you see. It's there. So it's like an employment agency that is there for young people when the wider economy offers little.
But it's also important to recognize that these neighborhoods were not all one thing or another. There's a lot of nuance in how people responded to the conditions where they lived. In his work, Professor Anderson explained that people describe themselves and others as being decent or being street, and the majority of people would describe themselves as decent, committed to family, to education, to making a better life for their kids. But the sense of being abandoned, having to protect yourself, was felt by everyone to some degree, and it caused everyone to have to maintain street credibility in public.
Well, these are not my words, this term decent and street. These are not my words. The ethnographer tries hard to listen to the people and to learn their vocabulary, you see, because again, you're looking at the way they meet the exigencies of life and the terms they develop as they do, the labels and all that. And so decent is a word that you hear in the barbershop. You hear it at church, you hear it in the community. And street is a word you hear. And so there's this tension between the two. There are people who are street, and there are people who are decent in the minds of people. And the decent people are people who work every day, who go to church, who are civil, who respect other people's property and everything else. And they're closely related to the middle class, so to speak, in terms of values and orientations and all. The street element is basically different. And these are people who are much more distressed, so to speak, and have issues of precarity that harm them, so to speak, that they have to scuffle to keep straight. And some of them easily sort of fall into the drug world or whatever it is, or criminality or whatever it is, you see. But the community divides itself up into the decent people and the street element. And sometimes these operate in the same person who may code switch depending on the circumstances. But out of it all, you want to be streetwise, so to speak. And as the boys on the corner say, you need to know what time it is when to act one way or the other, and to know who you are in the context of things.
Professor Anderson's book, Code of the Street, described a vicious cycle where Black people in deeply poor inner-city neighborhoods felt alienated because they'd been abandoned by law enforcement, they had few job opportunities, and they experienced persistent racism. This alienation fueled violence. And this violence confirmed the negative stereotypes that some of those who lived outside of these neighborhoods had for Black people in general, regardless of where those Black people actually came from. And these negative reactions were felt in everyday life, in big and small ways, from merely annoying to life-threatening. And they justified the alienation and hopelessness that people in these neighborhoods felt.
And these are all things that come out of years of ethnographic study in the community. I hung out with different young men. I walked the streets with young men. I went to crack houses with individuals. I knew drug dealers. I knew all kinds of people in the community in order to get at this issue. So the book, Code of the Street, kind of lays it all out. And so this it sort of goes beyond the headlines and renders, hopefully, the situation on the street every day. The thing about this kind of ethnography is that it's been corroborated in so many quantitative studies. And that's one reason why the book itself is so important, because it describes what's happening on the ground level. But it's also been corroborated through many, many quantitative studies.
With violent crime and shootings on the rise since the pandemic, the issues that Professor Anderson studied in the 1990s remain, and they're deeply relevant to our streets today. Here's something you may have already figured out about Professor Anderson's work. With each of his books, he's been adding another layer of complexity to our understanding of our cities. He began with A Place on the Corner, studying the social order of people that spent time hanging out at a street corner and its liquor store. In Streetwise, he turned his lens on the border to study the interactions between people in a mixed, gentrifying neighborhood and the predominantly Black adjacent blocks struggling with poverty, drugs, and crime. Then, in Code of the Street, he researched the deeply poor neighborhoods of the city to understand the conditions that people lived in and their responses to that environment, which fed violence. For his next area of study, Professor Anderson turned to those rare public spaces in the city where civility and tolerance seemed to reign. He discovered these areas after a move across town.
I was completing Code of the Street, when we left our neighborhood in West Philadelphia and we moved to Rittenhouse Square. Many of our neighbors were becoming very concerned about the crack cocaine epidemic, and they were experiencing it through stick-ups, and crack addicts would break into cars and would take whatever they could to exchange it for money for crack cocaine. It was really bad. But this was happening to our neighbors all around. And after so much happened, even my wife began to say, well, maybe it's time for us to move. And I resisted because, again, I was doing my work. But ultimately, I gave in. We moved from West Philadelphia to Rittenhouse Square.
And it was in Rittenhouse Square, sitting near the statue of the goat, where Professor Anderson came up with the concept of the cosmopolitan canopy.
It was really quite attractive. And one of the reasons was that it was so diverse in terms of the public space. All kinds of people were there: Black people, white people, homeless people, old people, young people. It was like this setting of cultural convergence. All these different kinds of people were essentially getting along. And all of this came together around the goat. And I sat for hours and hours and hours at the goat, watching and talking with people. And it was such a pleasant place that I would sometimes have office hours right on the square in good weather, or I would teach a class in the square. And my students would talk about the place and marvel at how much comity there was between and among different kinds of people. And you look up, and the old tree growth formed a canopy. And so it came to me that this was a cosmopolitan canopy, because in the canopy, it's an island of racial civility located in a sea of segregation.
Once Professor Anderson came up with this idea that Rittenhouse Square served as a cosmopolitan canopy, an island of racial civility located in a sea of segregation, he began to search for other canopy places in Philadelphia. He wrote about them in his fourth book, Cosmopolitan Canopy, published in 2011.
And I took that concept and applied to other places, namely the Reading Terminal Market. And I began to look for this kind of experience there. And of course, that too is a place of, it's diverse, incredibly diverse. And these people seem to get along. And I began to look at other spaces in Center City, including coffee shops and other spaces. And you could just kind of see that these canopies that were existing here and there as separate entities together had a synergy and were forming this kind of cosmopolitan zone, as it were.
While Professor Anderson studied these pleasant canopy spaces, he observed that people in these zones behaved in two basic ways: ethnocentric or cosmopolitan. Ethnocentrics evaluated other people based on their own cultural standards, while cosmopolitan types were less judgmental about people who were different than themselves.
And the zone is comprised of people who are pretty cosmopolitan. I mean, they dominate these spaces, but there are also people from certain parochial neighborhoods who come to these places too. And these people tend to be more ethnocentric. But I realize that they may be ethnocentric and they come in all races, but they tend to keep their ethnocentrism in check. They defer to the people who are cosmopolitan. The canopy is like a metaphor for civil society. It's what I realized. And of course, it's a wonderful civil society where everybody has a right to be there. But there are certain circumstances in which the people who are more ethnocentric or even racist can feel put upon by all the diversity they see. And they can draw the color line or the ethnic line or the sexual preference line or whatever it is. When they have had enough, they can't hold it in any longer. They just express it. And when they do draw the color line or the ethnic line or the gender line or whatever it is, the people who are marginalized experience this as a moment of acute disrespect.
And when this happens, this incivility, this moment of disrespect, can seem especially damaging because your guard is down and you don't expect it in the civil space of the cosmopolitan canopy.
And Black people call this the nigger moment. That's what they call it among themselves. They don't share this with white people typically, but they understand when they've had this moment of acute disrespect based on their blackness, and it's no fun. And I see that as it's an expression of the color line, but nothing is more powerful, in a sense, than the inward moment for Black people. And this drawing of the color line is like putting Black people in their place in the minds of so many Black people, you see. But of course, anybody can experience this moment of acute disrespect based on their particularity. Under the canopy, your defenses kind of go by the wayside. So when it happens under the canopy or these integrated settings, you can really feel it. You can feel your Blackness in a very powerful way. And it's a set of circumstances where you would assume that you wouldn't feel your particularity, your Blackness so much. But yet there it is, you know.
Classic example of this moment of disrespect happened just south of Rittenhouse Square in an incident at a Starbucks that made international news.
What you see in the Starbucks incident in 2018, after the book has been out since 2011, what you see is a book that kind of anticipates this drawing of the color line, you see. And that's what it is. Mm-hmm. These two Black men went into Starbucks, dressed casually, young men, and sat and waited for a friend. But then they had the audacity to request the bathroom code from the barista. And her question was, "Are you going to buy something?" And they said, "No," from what I read in the newspapers. And she became disturbed about that. And they had back and forth, and she called the police. And the police were there in minutes and arrested these two Black men, essentially for being Black in Starbucks, because the other customers get by without buying something every second. You can sit in Starbucks with one cup of coffee all day and work on your computer or whatever if you're white. But these men were called out because they were Black.
These young men, Dante Robinson and Rayshawn Nelson, later received settlements for their wrongful arrest from both Starbucks and the city of Philadelphia, which included the city agreeing to create a public high school program for young entrepreneurs. But this event highlights the glossy veneer of the cosmopolitan canopy. Running underneath these seemingly civil spaces are undercurrents of intolerance.
So what it says is that the canopy is a beautiful place until it's not. The canopy is diverse, there's comity, people are getting along, there's civility. But then there are circumstances in which the canopy gets rented. It exposes the fault lines of the canopy. And as I say, the canopy is a beautiful place, but it has fault lines. And the inward moment is the manifestation of the fault line.
These moments of disrespect in the canopy are so often based on race, and Professor Anderson's work shows how even the most civil and diverse public spaces are disrupted by the stereotypes we carry about people, Black people in particular, and their proper place in the world. Professor Anderson calls America's deep stereotype of Black place as the, quote, iconic ghetto.
See, the Black ghetto as a physical space is no longer just a physical space. I would argue that it's become iconic. It's become a symbol. It's become an image that hovers over unfamiliar Black people as they navigate these public spaces, as they navigate the world. There's that image. It indicates this netherworld to which Black people should be relegated in the minds of some prejudiced whites. Not all, but there are many people who assume that the other side of town, the Black side of town, is where the Black people belong. And what that does for Black people, anonymous Black people or unfamiliar Black people, it gives them a negative presumption that they must disprove in order to build trust with others they meet in these public spaces.
This idea of the iconic ghetto comes out of our country's history of slavery and racism.
The iconic ghetto is rooted in slavery. Slavery established the the black body at the bottom of the order. Justice Taney says in 1857 that black people have no rights that white people are bound to respect. This is the Dred Scott decision. But he's commenting about the status of black people during that time. And this kind of solidified this principle of white over black. A lot of white people became deeply invested in this notion of white over black, from back to slavery through segregation. And these are things that they just knew. And this became institutionalized and passed on from one generation to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next. The result being that it's deeply ingrained in the psyche of folk, if you know what I mean. You have to struggle to get beyond it if you're white. And these are just things you take for granted. And black folk know this because they're part of the same society. It's just that they don't agree with being at the bottom, you see. And it's not that the white people hate the black people. I mean, always. We just don't think much of them. And this is the rub, you see. This is the rub.
Professor Anderson's concept of the iconic ghetto is based in our history of deeply segregated neighborhoods formed through coercion, redlining, and restrictive covenants.
I mean, after emancipation and the war, the Civil War, black people migrated to towns and cities of the South and the North. And their stigma of blackness both preceded them and followed them. And as they made their way to these places, many people in these towns said, keep on going, don't stop. But black people did stop, and they stopped on the outskirts of town. The white people said, you must be out by sundown. And some of these towns became known as sundown towns. And black people settled on the outskirts of these towns in shanty towns. And a symbiotic relationship developed between these towns and the black community. Over time, these towns grew up around these black communities. And these black communities became the place where the black folk live in the popular mind.
Today, Professor Anderson argues that the image of what is perceived as the black part of town continues to impact how all black people are perceived in society.
But the thing about the ghetto as a physical space is that you can objectify it, you can see it, you see. The thing about the iconic ghetto is that it becomes this image, this symbol. Therefore, it's not just a physical space. It's a deep source of stereotype, prejudice, and discrimination, symbolic discrimination. And to have black skin in the minds of some white people is to be relegated almost instantly to that place. That's where you come from.
Professor Anderson believes that the stereotype of the iconic ghetto, the symbolic racism of what's believed to be, quote, black place, causes the insults that people face every day. This is the new color line that black people are dealing with today. And it's the subject of Professor Anderson's latest book, published in 2022, called Black in White Space: The Enduring Impact of Color in Everyday Life. In this book, he expands his examination of public space in Philadelphia to include workplaces, gyms, and anywhere that people might meet outside of the home.
And so as I wound up the Canopy book with the last chapter, the inward moment, I began to question, like, what's going on in white space? So that set the problem for me for the next book, Black in White Space. And I could see that black people, middle-class black people, were having all these insults. It's amazing how many insults black people endure in everyday life, especially middle-class black people. And to experience the inward moment is to feel as though somebody has tried to put you in your place with acute disrespect. But these insults are pretty common, you see. And these are not known by most white people because black people don't want to be whiners. They don't want to complain. They tell their black friends about it, but they seldom tell white people about these things. They break it down for their black friends. They compare notes, and they see this as the black tax. That's just what you get for being black in American society.
So let's first explain Professor Anderson's use of the term white space. It's important to know that white space is a perception. It's how some people perceive some spaces as being dominated by white people. So, two different people may enter the same area but have completely different impressions. A white person may just see a corporate office, but a Black person might see the same office as a white space that they have to travel through very carefully.
Essentially, it's a perceptual category, and it's different things to different people. Typically, in American society, the more privileged spaces are spaces dominated by white people. This is where the goodies are, oftentimes education, a night on the town, the workplace, and there are relatively few Blacks in these spaces.
And then there's also places that are perceived to be deep white spaces.
Well, I mean, deep white space, you just never expect any Black people. And you, as a Black person, are the only one, and you expect to be the only one. And if you see another Black person, you're surprised. Literally, you see your eyebrows raise.
And these white spaces present problems that have to be navigated by the Black community.
And this organizes the Black community to some extent. So they know on some level they have to deal with that white space. And the people who control that white space, the people who are privileged in that white space on the basis of their color. And so what this means is that as you move through white space, as a Black person, you expect to meet at least three types of people. White people who mean you well, white people who don't mean you well, and this wide swath of white people who are unconcerned. That's what you expect to do. That's what you expect to see in white space. And so when you enter the white space, I mean, you look for allies because you know that this space is problematic. You look for those white people who mean you well. You look for Black people there and you assume they mean you well. So when you see a Black person in white space, you typically acknowledge that person. And the Black person oftentimes nods back, not always. And that's taken as a sign too. So the first thing is to look for allies, the people who mean you well, whether they're Black, white, or whatever. And you know there are a lot of white people who do mean you well. You know that. But you also know, as I say, there are white people who just don't want you there, but can't say it. They sometimes act in ways that stop you, that block you, that let you know that you are Black, and that means something to them. And you look for that. And the problem for the Black person is to tell who is who and which is which, and then to get out of the way, to use evasive action when you need to survive.
As Black people navigate white space, some feel a need to constantly prove to white people that they're okay. Some have called it, quote, the dance, and it's exhausting.
When you dance, and this is a derisive term used by some Black people about how they manage themselves in this space. And your obligation, in a sense, as you navigate the white space, is to disabuse people of the notion that there's stereotypes about the ghetto and stereotypes about you as belonging to that ghetto may be misplaced, you see, that they don't apply. And that's your challenge. But when you dance before basically an audience that is not necessarily sympathetic, in part because, given our societal history, the people's, at least maybe most of the people of that audience, for most of them, the minds are made up about where you belong. And decidedly, you belong to the Black space much more quickly than you belong to the white space. So as you move through, you have to disabuse people of that notion. And that's not an easy thing to do.
And Professor Anderson underscores that this constant evaluation and reassurance is necessary because Black people know that they're likely to be treated differently in white space.
But this is premised on the fact that the Black person in the space is just not treated the same as the white people in that space. That you as a Black person, no matter what you are, no matter who you are, no matter what your presumed status is, you move about with a relative deficit of credibility. And that deficit of credibility works out as moral authority to some extent. And you realize that Black people simply don't have the same moral authority as the white people. And this is really what inequality is really all about. The respect is not always there. The Black people oftentimes find themselves, interviewed them, I've studied them, I've talked with them. They feel that they must oftentimes demand respect. They don't always command respect. And when they demand respect, the grace is lost.
And this whole effort to enter white space and take advantage of the opportunities there is geared towards minimizing the negative moments, the insults that they expect to find there.
See, the two kinds of moments, the small ones that people attribute to the Black tax, but then there are the big ones. The big ones can get you fired from your job. The big ones keep you from getting an apartment that you want and you know you should have. The big ones can get you stopped by the police. The big ones can get you killed, and all for arbitrary reasons, you see. So this is one thing that distinguishes the Black insult that Black people call the N-word moment sometimes. It distinguishes it from microaggressions. Micro means little, small. But these things, as they accumulate, become big, and they can affect your health, your outlook, your perspective, your view of the openness of the wider society.
So the talk that Black parents have with their children is about teaching them how to safely navigate white space to hopefully avoid those big moments.
You give them the talk, which is all about trying to help them to anticipate these problems, so to speak, so that they won't become consumed by them and hurt by them, so they can avoid them somehow, can manage themselves in these circumstances, you see. And you want them to be awake to this kind of racism, this peculiar symbolic racism that Black people, because of their skin color, endure and have to deal with.
Professor Anderson's book, Black and White Space, is just the latest contribution to his ongoing work that shows us how race impacts everyday lives in America.
Yeah, see, all this is a body of work, which each successive book serving as a corollary of the work that came before. So it's a body of work over 50 years. And this book, Black and White Space, is the present document.
We've come a long way from that farm in the Mississippi Delta where Professor Anderson's story began. I asked Professor Anderson about what he hopes he's achieved with his work.
Well, you do your work, and you do it as truthfully and as accurate as you can. And you hope and pray for deeper understanding and, by implication, better solutions to the problems we face. And successive generations will have questions. I mean, the value of a book, to some extent, the value of the work has to do with its provocation, you see. It's good to the extent that it can provoke new questions or questions that people could never think of prior to the work itself. And I was always taught that the questions are more important than the answers.
So maybe that's the takeaway for this episode. Ask questions. They're likely to lead to new ones, which ultimately may lead us to better solutions. So keep asking questions. Professor Anderson certainly will.
Me, I'm just curious, and I love to think about people, and my curiosity continues.
Thank you for listening to the Found in Philadelphia podcast. And I want to send a final huge, heartfelt thank you to Professor Anderson for the many, many hours he spent with me and his patience in helping me finally get this episode done. Thank you so much. If you're enjoying this series, please drop me a review and share the podcast with a friend. And please check out the podcast website to learn more, see some period images, and find a list of my sources. This podcast was researched, written, and hosted by me, Lori Ament. Cyril Tayendi recorded this interview at the Community Recording Studios at Drexel University. It was so fun. This episode was mixed by the amazing engineers at The Wave Podcasting. Thank you, guys.